Hello everyone! Here I'd like to compare the form or suffixes, endings of the past tense in the four Romance languages that I'm learning. That is Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Italian. I'll be focusing only on regular verbs in indicative mood. And I'll discuss all forms, even those that are rarely used or used only in some varieties of the respective languages. This is not a detailed analysis, it's only a basic comparison from my point of view as a learner. So let's start. I'll start by comparing the first group of verbs in Spanish and Portuguese. So they are as follows. Hablé, hablaste, habló, hablamos, hablasteis, hablaron. This was Spanish. And now Portuguese is practically the same. The endings are very similar. Falei, falaste, falou, falamos, falastes, falaram. If we look at the second and third group of verbs in Spanish, they are conjugated in the same way. So the second group is comí, comiste, comió, comimos, comisteis, comieron. And the third group, the same endings. Viví, viviste, vivió, vivimos, vivisteis, vivieron. If we look at Portuguese, the second and third group differ. So the second group is conjugated as follows. Comi, comeste, comeu. Comemos, comestes, comerão. And the third group, parti, partiste, partiu, partimos, partistes, partiram. We can see that the third group is very similar to Spanish, with a small exception in the third person singular and third person plural, but it's not a significant difference. However, in the second group of Portuguese verbs, we can see that they are differentiated from the third group, and they preserve the e sound in the endings in all persons except for the first person singular. So it's comeste, comeu, comemos, comestes, comerão. Only the first person is identical with the third group. Comi, parti. On the whole, the endings in Portuguese are very similar to Spanish. Of course, apart from those forms in the second group which are different in Portuguese. Now, if we look at Italian, the first group of Italian verbs is conjugated as follows. Parlai, parlasti, parlò, parlammo, parlaste, parlarono. On the whole, we can see that the endings in this group of Italian verbs are very similar to other two already mentioned languages, Spanish and Portuguese. There are only slight differences, but we can see strong similarity. If we look at the second and third group of Italian verbs, we can see that Italian, similarly to Portuguese, maintains the difference between the second and third group. So the second group of Italian verbs is conjugated as follows. Credei, or credetti, credesti, credè, or credette, credemmo, credeste, crederono, or credettero. As we can see, in the first and third person singular and in the third person plural, Italian has two possible forms. Both of them are considered correct. If we look carefully at the second group of Italian verbs, we can see that they differ from the first group mostly only by changing the vowel a in the ending to e. So I changes to a in the first person, asti, esti, o, e. Ammo, emmo, aste, este, arono, erono. So the difference between these two groups, the first and the second group, is quite regular. If we look at the third group of Italian verbs, we can see that it's conjugated as follows. Apri, apristi, apri. Aprimmo, apriste, aprirono. Again, we can see that the endings in this group differ from the first two groups of Italian verbs only in vowel e, which replaces in the endings the vowel a or e from the previous two groups of Italian verbs. I, isti, I, immo, iste, irono. These endings contain the vowel e. If we compare this third group of Italian verbs with the two other languages that I already mentioned, we can see that they are quite similar, Spanish viví, viviste, vivió. In Italian, aprì, apristi, aprì. There is only a slight difference in the third person singular, and in plural, vivimos, vivisteis, vivieron. In Spanish and in Italian, aprimmo, apriste, aprirono. We can see the similarity here as well. Now, let's have a look at French, where the first group of French verbs is conjugated as follows: parler, parla, parla, parlam, parlat, parler. As we can see, pronunciation doesn't distinguish some forms. However, the difference can be seen in the written form. If we look at the endings in their written form, we can see that they are similar to other languages, especially if we look at Portuguese and Italian, but also with Spanish. There are some differences, like in the second person singular, the ending is shorter, parla, compared to Italian parlasti, Portuguese falasti, or Spanish hablaste. But on the whole, the endings are very similar. If we look at the second and third group of French verbs, we can observe that the endings are practically identical, with the exception of the first person plural, which is different in the second and third group of French verbs. All of these endings are different from the first group of French verbs. So the second group is conjugated as follows: fini, 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 finim, finit, finir. And the third group is conjugated as follows: vendi, 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 vendim, vendit, vendir. So here we can see the difference in the first person plural. Finim, vendim. If we look at the second and third group of French verbs, we can see that their endings are identical apart from the written form of the first person plural. Finim, vendim. If we look at these two groups, second and third, in French, we can see that they have I vowel, which is generally in the third group of Spanish, Portuguese, and Italian. So here we could see that the past tense forms are simpler in Spanish and French, where in both of these languages, the second group and third group of verbs are conjugated in the same way, with one tiny exception in French first person plural. And we can see that in Portuguese and Italian, the difference in conjugation of the three groups of verbs in each of these languages is kept, unlike in Spanish and French. So this was an overview of the past tense forms in Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Italian. If you have any other observations regarding their form in this tense, you can write them down in the comments. You can write down some examples. Thank you very much for watching, and see you again next time. Goodbye.